Back when I served as a youth minister at a church in North Carolina, every summer the men of the church would take a month at the local county jail, and every Wednesday or Thursday, whatever day of the week it was, that month we would go out every week and lead a worship service in the chapel of that jail. It was all men in this jail, and they would file into the chapel. They would fill it up. It was a pretty sizable chapel, and it would be full of men in this county jail. And 7 or 8 of us from the church who came, and I would preach sometimes and play the piano for the hymns, and the men would sing. And honestly, I've never been a part of a church, including this one, that sings with that much fervor and conviction and volume. It was an incredible experience, and I can still hear those hymns being sung by those men in that jail. Their favorite hymn that they sang every week, no matter what the other hymns were, was "They'll know we are Christians by our love." That's the hymn I can still hear if I concentrate on that memory. And this passage today is one that I think is actually one of the most challenging for Christians in the U.S. because it is a consistent reminder to us that our history as a faith tradition, as followers of Jesus, is bound up in a critique of prisons. Now, we are pretty good, at least a lot of liberal progressive Christians, at critiquing the injustices of our prison system and the prison industrial complex and things of that nature, and the racial injustices bound up in the new Jim Crow and all that. But we aren't very keen on critiquing prisons, period. Prisons have almost become a part of our accepted status quo Christian imagination, something we think is normal and natural. But this text really calls those assumptions into question. And I want to invite you to think about this passage each time you sing a hymn in your congregation, either as we worship on Zoom or as we gather back together at OCBC. When you're gathered with your congregation, think about this passage. At midnight, Paul and Silas were praying and singing hymns to God, and the prisoners were listening to them. When we sing our hymns and pray our prayers, we are doing so in solidarity with those prisoners all around the world who are also our siblings. And we are reminded in this passage, in the singing of our hymns and the praying of our prayers, that our faith tradition is rooted in a figure who was arrested and convicted and sentenced and executed. And as we read the book of Acts, we see the apostles who were the progenitors of this movement following Jesus were imprisoned over and over and over again. And when I was growing up in Sunday school, I remember thinking about this passage as being one about Paul and Silas being wrongfully imprisoned, and what good people they were to just stay in the prison after the prison doors were open, and all of that. But that's not really the point here of this passage. They weren't wrongfully imprisoned. They were rightfully imprisoned. And all throughout our Christian tradition and all throughout the world today, when we think about prisoners, we often think about how many people are wrongfully imprisoned or who are unjustly convicted, but we don't think about the injustices bound up in the entirety of the prison system, our imagination that says prisons are natural and necessary. And if you notice in this passage, when the earthquake came, it wasn't Paul and Silas, the good disciples, who were sitting in prison, who were freed to leave because their prison doors were opened. It was the entirety of the prison. Every door was opened. I also want you to notice in this passage the way that Paul and Silas refused to go out into the night and leave the prison in secret. They made a statement with their release. And Willie Jennings compares this to Nelson Mandela's release from prison, when the president of South Africa at the time told Mandela that the very next day he would be released from prison and flown to Johannesburg. And Mandela had a different idea, and this is what Mandela wrote or said to the president. I told him that I strongly objected to that. I wanted to walk out of the gates of Victor Verster to be able to thank those who looked after me and greet the people of Cape Town. Though I was from Johannesburg, Cape Town had been my home for nearly 3 decades. I would make my way back to Johannesburg, but when I chose to, not when the government wanted me to. Once I was free, I said, I will look after myself. So I want to invite you, as we read this passage today and throughout the rest of the book of Acts, to really notice the way that incarceration plays a critical role in the early Jesus movement, and to invite you to consider how our critique of prisons, not just the injustices of the system, but the system as a whole, might be actually a cornerstone of the Christian faith that we have largely forgotten as we've given up our imagination at least in this particular way, to this notion that prisons are normal and natural and necessary and unquestionable. One thing that opened my eyes to some critiques of the prison in general was when a few years ago I read this little book by Angela Davis called Are Prisons Obsolete? You can see it's a tiny little book by this incredible, famous author, scholar, activist, Angela Davis. I'd encourage you to pick up this little book if you can get a hold of it and take a look at it. It's not about how prisons and our justice system are unjustly run. It's about how prisons themselves are a cornerstone of injustice. And if we take the book of Acts seriously, I think that's a message that we need to embrace as followers of an incarcerated and executed God.